level of your commitment to religion and to Yiddishkeit, certain words, certain phrases are very commonly heard, right? So one of those things is the yenta. Everybody knows the yenta. In fact, it's not only a Jewish phenomenon, it's across all borders. You ask most people what a yenta is, they'll tell you it's a gossip monger, it's someone who likes to gossip. You know, when you're a kid, when you're listening, when you're eavesdropping on a conversation, or you ask a question about who's who, and you want to find out who's this person's family and what's the good gossip, automatically the first thing your mother does or your father would do to you, or at least in my house, would be stop being such a yenta, get out of here. You know, you're being yenta. Now yenta, funny enough, is actually a name. When I was 17, my great grandmother passed away. So. And I always knew her as Lena Light, and she was my grandfather's mother, wonderful little lady, came from Russia, you know, went through the siege of Leningrad. She was really, he used to sit there, she used to tell us stories about the old Haim. She used to get very proud that she had one of my cousins who became a doctor. You know, she's one of a very typical Jewish grandmother in that respect. And then she passed away, you know, of old age. And then when I came to the Levaya, when we got into New York and we saw the funeral procession, I saw the day that on her matzeva or when they're saying Kaddish, her name actually wasn't Lena, but her name was Yenta. So I asked my Zaidi about it, and he said, yeah, her name was Yenta, but the name has negative connotations these days. In other words, people don't like calling each other Yenta, so we called her. She preferred to be called Lena. And so much so that when, you know, my mother's family is a large family, so when children were being born in the next year, people wanted to name, my aunts and uncles wanted to name their children after their grandmother. My grandfather said that, you know, he said that she had preferred that nobody named their child Yenta, rather name something similar like Yetta, in order that the child shouldn't have to have a name which is very, you know, it's just synonymous with a gossiper. And if you understand Ashkenazi Jewry, you can definitely, if you grew up, you understand that naming after a child and the whole process of naming is people are very pedantic about it. We're very careful, and people care a lot about it. You have to name exactly after the person, exactly the semantics. This is just illustrating to what extent the name Yenta has become associated with a gossiper. But how did this happen? Yenta was actually a popular Jewish name. So the story is that in the 1920s, there was this columnist, okay, for a Yiddish newspaper. The Yiddish newspaper was the Forward. And he used to write a weekly like sketches of the Lower East Side. I mean, not like a physical sketch of a comic strip, but more like a scene. He would set a scene and he would write this comic strip. And he was known as B. Covener. And that was a pseudonym. And he used to write about these different characters in the Jewish community in the Lower East Side. And one of the characters who created was this lady named Yenta Telebender. And this lady was a lady who knew all the gossip in town. She was her husband was constantly running away from her. She was running after her. She was the big gossip. She was this big character. And by far and away, anybody who read this column really was waiting for her adventures and waiting to hear more about her. And so it became a common sight on the Lower East Side to hear the name Yenta being associated with ladies that were coming to the market, they're haggling, or that a woman was gossiping. You'd be like, oh, you're being such a Yenta. And it was after this character from this comic. And so it slowly started creeping into society. And then of course, what happens when Fiddler on the Roof comes out, when the play comes out, and the highly successful play, and the matchmaker and the big gossip in Fiddler on the Roof, her name happens to be Yenta, and so you combine these two things, and suddenly you have what we know is today's modern day Yenta, and pretty much nobody's able to escape that anymore. And the first thing you hear of Yenta is you think of someone who's a gossiper. But the name Yenta actually comes from the name Yentel. Yentel means gentle, and Yenta was an extremely popular name for Jewish children, for Jewish girls in the 20th century. And what popularized the name Yentel? Well, there's a famous play by Isaac Bashevis Singer known as Yentel. What's the play about? It's a play about a girl who decides she wants to go to yeshiva. She wants to go to yeshiva, and so she dresses up like a boy and she goes to yeshiva. And this girl, her name was Yentl. Where did he base this play on? Where did he come up with such a beautiful and interesting idea that a girl who wants to learn Gemara and she wants to come to yeshiva? Well, now we've gone a little bit convoluted in our way, but we've arrived at our topic for today. And her name was Chana Rachel Zerbermacher, or as some people know her, or most commonly known as the Maiden of Ludmir. She would inspire this play, Yentl, of inspiration of her life. She would inspire quite a few things in her life, later in her life, and obviously today, Yenta actually came out, but that's just an interesting tidbit, and now we're getting onto our actual subject matter. There are few people in history which are unique, meaning when you look at history, when one learns history, we almost always have a precedent. We almost always have someone before that person who had some similarities to them, meaning there's very few originals in history. And when you do have an original, these are the people that change history because there's no one like them before them, and therefore they usher in a new era. Chana Rachel was definitely one of those people because there's no one like her till her point in history, and I haven't seen anyone like her since then. Now, who was she and what was her life? Well, before we get started, we have to know a couple things. First of all, when talking about women as a male, and when you're talking about women, you have to be careful to distinguish by not talking for women, by talking about women. In other words, in history, a lot of times when a man would want to, it's an old saying that a man wants to talk for women, so he talk about women. We have to distinguish that. Although I know the story over here, any questions or any interesting ideas that would come out of this discussion I'm not trying to prove a point, I'm trying to bring it to the forefront, just trying to raise a discussion. And then what you decide as a male or as a female, how the story applies to modern day is up to you. It's up for you to decide. But I'm not here to tell you the answers or tell you the questions. I'm just here to tell you what happens, and then you have to figure out what you take out of it. Also, it is also very important to note that the story of Chana Rachel Zerbermacher is not historically documented very well. And the reason for that, simply put, is because women in that era, women in the 1800s, were not documented by themselves. They were only documented in association with their husband or with the family that they belonged to. So any famous women that we have of that era usually is because they're part of a bigger family, either a royal family, or they were married to someone who was very, very important and was historically documented. And whether their husband died and then they took off a life of their own, which is fine. But again, if they were by themselves, women a lot of times were excluded from history. This is especially true for the Jewish community in Europe and in Russia of those days. So we know she existed. We have definitely proof of certain areas, certain ideas, and that she had a following, and that as the story we will tell, she became a Rabbi. But the exact details of her story and which legends are true and which are myth are not verified 100% because practically we cannot verify them. I'm going to tell the story with certain details the way I imagined it or the way I based it off various sources. If you want to actually learn the story properly and see all the differing opinions and all the details and all the steps in her life, because there's like 5 different opinions on each step of how it happened and how could have it happened. Then there's a book by Nathaniel Deitch, The Maiden of Ludmir, which is a thorough investigation in all these different opinions and the historical accuracy. But here we're not trying to give you the historical accuracy, we're just trying to tell you a version so you can understand a little bit about who she was and what she did. Okay, there is a famous Yiddish play known as the Dibbuk. The Dibbuk talks about a story of a malevolent spirit which enters into the body of a girl and won't leave her until the rabbi performs an exorcism. This play was written by a man by the name of Shalom Ansky. Now, Shalom Ansky was a man who went around Russia and believed in trying to save Judaism. He believed that unless we document the minute traditions of the folklore, of the simple life of the Jews, And he's not talking about the Torah. He's not talking about what's written in the Torah, because that, we have for eternity. If we don't figure out what the simple day-to-day life is, he believed that eventually Europe is not going to be suitable for the Jews, and people are going to forget what it was like to live in the shtetl, to have the day-to-day life, to have the shilas, to have the questions of a Jew, what it was like, the blood, sweat, and tears for a normal Jew in the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th century. If we didn't document it then, he started documenting around 1911, and he felt it would be lost forever. And he wasn't wrong, as we know what happened with Europe and the Jews. But most of our understanding of what it meant to be a Jew in those days, for the normal Jew, the regular shtetl Jew, comes from his questionnaires, and he traveled throughout Europe, and he made these very thorough questionnaires, not asking for things that were real, and other things that were authentic according to Torah, just asking what it was like, what do people feel, what do people think if you're a simple Yid who grew up and you work the farm and you work a simple job, and we owe a lot to his research. After going through various expeditions throughout Russia, he came back, and in 1914 he began writing this play known as the Dybbuk. Now the Dybbuk became a book, it became a play, it became a silent film in the 30s. It's one of the most successful Jewish plays of all time, and it's very well known. And the question is, where did he find the inspiration for this play about the spirit that's entered this girl? And we look at his travelogue, we can see that he did visit a town of Ludmir. Now, where is Ludmir? Ludmir is one of those towns where you never really know what it belongs to, because every couple of years in those days it would change, right? One day it would be part of Russia, the next day it would be part of Poland, sometimes it was Ukraine was considered its own country. It sat on the border of Ukraine and Poland. So depending on the time and the era, depending on who would own this little town. But it was actually quite a metropolis. It was a nice city. There were parts of it that were nicer than others. But in its heyday, it had a large community. And not only did it have a large contingency, it also had a large Jewish community. In fact, the Rav of the city at a certain point was Yom Tov Litman Heller, or as he's known, the Tosfos Yom Tov. The Tosfos Yom Tov was a great scholar in the 17th century. And he needed a position, and the town of Ludmir offered him a position as rabbi. So you can imagine the sway and the power this community must have had if they were able to pull and if they were able to draw them a man like the Tosfos Yom Tov, one of the great scholars of his time, and to this town to be their rabbi. It ended a little bit in disaster, actually, because there was a political fight for power, and the Tosfos Yom Tov ended up on the wrong side of the fight. And what happens is that he actually gets thrown out of town. In other words, he has to leave. With the authorities got involved, and it became a mess. And what he says is, he actually puts a curse on the town, and he says that no Rav will ever really succeed here. And legend has it that no Rav really did succeed there. But that just shows the Jewish population in Ludmir was quite popular. It was a center. Now, the next stage of Ludmir's growth as a Jewish center happened with the founding of Hasidism. So the Baal Shem Tov, in the mid-1700s, the Baal Shem Tov becomes out, and he founds this sect, this way of learning Torah, this new idea of Hasidus, of serving God with joy, and emphasis on prayer and good deeds over specifically learning. And he founds this new way, and it takes the entire area by storm, and it changed the outlook of Judaism in Europe and forevermore the whole world. And at that point, Ludmir was a regular town in Russia. One of the Talmidim of the Maggid, which means it was the third generation. In other words, if you go by Chabad era, it would be the Alter Rebbe's era, which is the first Chabad Rebbe. His name is Rabbi Aaron of Karlin. He came originally from Karliner, and he was known as the Karliner. And he was looking for a place to set up his Hasidic order, a very well-known tzaddik, a man who was one of the Chevraya Kedisha, one of the original Hasidic masters. And he chose the town of Ludmir to become his hub. So he set up court there. And from then on, Ludmir until World War II was a hub, was a center for Hasidic thought. It was one of the main Hasidic towns. You have a town like Lubavitch, which was the town of Chabad. You have a town like Masta, you have Ruzhin, whatever. You have different towns which house different tzaddikim. Ludmir became its own center. And Rabbi Aaron Karlin set up court there. Now, he passes away. And a couple years later, at the turn of the 18th century is where our story takes place. So understanding the background is very important. And now we've reached a point in time where our story really does begin in earnest. Historians debate the year, but around 1805, there was a man who lived in Ludmir, and his name was Monish Verbermacher. Now, Monish was a chassid of Reb Mottel of Chernobyl. Chernobyl, yes, the Chernobyl that we might be familiar with from the disaster of the nuclear plant, which of course happened in the 80s. The Chernobyl was actually a very large city and also had a very large Hasidic presence, always was. And there were various Rabbeim known as the Chernobylers, meaning they were the Chernobyl dynasty. And it wasn't so far from Ludmir. It's not so close. It was a couple of days travel, but it was within region. And by far the most prominent Rebbe in that region was Reb Mottel of Chernobyl, who was a son of the original Chernobyler, who was the second in line in the Chernobyl dynasty. And what happens is that Monesh is a wealthy businessman, and he's doing very well. He's a very successful businessman, and he's a Baal Tzedakah. He's a person who gives out charity. He's a philanthropist, and people love him, and he's very well liked in town. However, he marries his wife, and he has a wonderful marriage, but unfortunately, they cannot have children, and they're trying, and they're trying, and they're trying, but they just, unfortunately, it's not happening. So about 10 years after his marriage, that's always the point in Jewish law where it tells you have to start really going out of your comfort zone. His wife tells him, please go to Reb Mottel of Chernobyl and ask for a bracha. Go to the Rebbe and ask him that we should have a child. So he travels to Reb Mottel. He comes into the Yechidus and he begs, please Rebbe, give me a child. And Reb Mottel tells him, don't worry. When it comes the time, you'll have a child. And Monesh turns back and he goes, no, that's not enough. I don't want a bracha that when it comes the time and when it's the proper time, I want to have it. I want a bracha that I'm going to have a child now. So the story goes, Reb Mottel tells him, you've rushed it a bit, but you'll get your bracha, you'll have a kid. Okay, so he goes home, and 9 months later, he has a child. It's a baby girl. Right? And she's a wonderful girl. They name her Chana Rachel, and she's a baby. Now, from her youth, Chana Rachel, there's stories of her being a wunderkind, her being a child prodigy. She's meant to be extremely smart, and in an era where women, Jewish women, didn't really have a real education, per se, where she learned Hebrew when she was young, attended Cheder alongside the boys, learned everything a normal a girl at that era would have learned, and went even further by knowing halachic law and starting to learn Gemara, things that were never, that at that era were not taught to women. Of course, when she continues on life, when she's already past the age of where she can go to Cheder, she continues studying quietly, and she's going into adolescence. She's turning around 11, 12 years old, coming close to Bas Mitzvah. And Chana Rachel starts to do commandments which are normally reserved for males, such as wearing a talis or laying tefillin, and she begins to do this. Now, instances in Judaism of a woman performing mitzvahs, commandments, which are normally commanded to men, for instance, putting on tefillin, we have a very famous case of that in Rashi's daughters. We know that Rashi had 3 daughters who married 3 men who would become what we know as Tosfos, becomes a Tosfos school in France. And all 3 of those daughters were meant to be very holy individuals who actually put on tefillin. A woman is not commanded, according to Jewish law, to put on tefillin every day like a man is. However, she is allowed to if she wants to. Okay? In other words, you're not commanded, but there's no prohibition saying she cannot put on tefillin. So Chana Rachel would put on tefillin, and people began to talk about her. She began to become a topic in town. This interesting lady, is this just a misguided child, or is this really a child who's something special? And listen, people fell on different sides of the debate, but it wasn't very threatening, and it wasn't so controversial, because at that point Chana Rachel was still very young, and so it was more like an interesting topic which you wanted to bring up something and say, hey, look at this anomaly. Here we have Chana Rachel Vermacher, this kid. But tragedy struck early in her life when at 12 years old, her mother passes away. Okay, now her mother was the one person who she really felt like she understood her, the one person who stood up for her. And although her father was very much, she understood, he loved him, but as a man in the 1800s, at the turn of the 19th century, a woman, even putting on tefillin was so unheard of that her father was at a loss, didn't understand her need or her want to do commandments which applied to men. And he didn't understand the need for her to want to learn Torah. In his mind, it didn't make sense. So although he loved her, there was a disconnect between him and his daughter. On the other hand, her mother understood her more. And when she passed away, it was more than just, obviously every passing away of a young child of a mother is tragic, but over here, there was no one else she felt that could actually understand what she was doing. However, before Chana Rachel's mother passed away, she requested from her husband, a deathbed wish that he ask her when it comes to the shidduch. Now, this was against all precedent at that time, because it was never the way that people asked their children for a shidduch in that era. The way it was that the parents would figure out what's the good shidduch, what's a good family, and what's a good person they think would work for their child. They would have the best intentions in mind, hopefully. Sometimes they didn't, but hopefully most of the time they did. And they would make a shidduch. And then you did that for your child, and your child did that for their child. And that was the tradition, and that was the way it went about. And she tells her husband that, I'm telling you, for Chana Rachel, she's not the typical girl. Speak to her about her shidduch before you go into shidduchim, because she was already 12 years old, and in that era, it was a couple years away, and shidduch was around the corner. So as on a deathbed wish, he doesn't deny it. He agrees to it, and then she passes away, and she gets buried in the town graveyard. So people have different reactions to tragedy when it strikes, and Chana Rachel's reaction, her way of finding solace and grieving, was to throw herself into the books, and to distract herself by becoming even more dedicated to Judaism and more dedicated to her ways of learning and studying and praying with even more vigor. And that's what she did. And she continued, and she had this little room in her house, and she completely dedicated herself day and night to learning, davening, and to praying, and to being, a exemplary Jew. And she really cut off. She becomes sort of a holy hermit, you can say. She cut off from people tremendously, and just sat in her room and had a couple slices of bread a day, otherwise dedicating herself to God. When it came time for shidduchim, a couple years later, what happens is when it comes time for shidduchim, everybody wanted to marry or to be involved with this girl, and the reason is because, as you can imagine, Monish von Bermacher was a wealthy man, and he was offering a very large dowry. Also, it was known that she was a pious girl. I mean, for all her interesting habits, she definitely was someone who believes in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism. And so a lot of shidduchim kept on coming up, and finally Monish finds a boy from a good family, a Torah, a scholar, someone who he believes is a perfect fit for Chana Rachel, and he goes to Chana Rachel. And remembering his promise to his wife, his deceased wife, he comes over and he says, listen, Chana, I have the perfect match for you. And she tells her father, no, I'm not marrying that guy. She goes, what do you mean? He goes, I already have the shidduch. I already have someone I'm going to get married to. And he goes, well, what does this mean? And she tells him, and there was this boy, Meir. Meir was a good boy, no mistaking. He was a nice boy from Ludmir, but he came from an undistinguished family. There wasn't no yichus, the ancestry didn't shine forth, and he wasn't the greatest scholar, but he wasn't the worst. He was a normal, regular, refined boy. But she wanted to marry him. She had known Meir her whole life because Meir was her chavrusa when she was back in Cheder before she had been, before she left. When she got too old for Cheder, she was his chavrusa, and so she wanted to marry Meir. Now, of course, there was a fight, and of course, her father refused. But eventually, after remembering the promise that he made to his wife, he acquiesced and he said, "You know what? If this is what you want to do, he's not a bad boy. Well, you can get married." Okay. They started getting preparations, and they set a date in a couple months in advance. It's going to be a wedding. It's going to be a big affair. The whole town's going to be there. Manish Verbermacher's son, the big businessman daughter, Also, everybody knows about her. She's interesting. The girl, and everybody's waiting. Now, during the months leading up, for the first time in Chana Rachel's life, she starts having trouble concentrating on her studies. Because for the first time in life, she feels the pangs of a relationship, of a romantic relationship, and she feels that she has feelings in her heart, and she can't concentrate, on her heart. She's being pulled in two different directions. One part of her is pulling her in the direction of Torah and of the books and of her studies, and for the first time in life, another part of her heart is pulling her in the direction of her fiance and trying to, and thinking about him and wanting to spend all her time with him. And so for the first time ever, Chana Rachel felt, she was in love, and she couldn't concentrate. So she started making a visit to her mother's grave in the cemetery of Ludmir, and she used to pray and daven by her mother's grave. Now, it was very common for women of that era, before they were married, to visit the deceased and ask for a blessing to go forward. But Chana Rachel started doing it very often, not just once before a wedding. As we spoke about before, she felt that her mother was one of the only people who understood her, and therefore she went to go pray. Now, it happens that one day, after a very intense session of praying, Chana Rachel collapses and she goes unconscious. When they find her, they rush her home, they bring her, and they get the doctor, and the doctor looks at her and he's trying to get her up, and he says, "Listen, she's fallen into a comatose state. There's nothing we can do. You have to pray and hope for the best." I don't know. In other words, there's no answer medically at this time. And Monesh doesn't know what to do. This is his only daughter. This is his only person he has left in his life. So he gets, after standing a couple days vigil by her bedside, he gets on a horse and he travels to Chernobyl, back to the Rebbe, and he comes in and he gets Yechidus with the Chernobyl Rebbe, and his tears are in his eyes, and he tells the Rebbe, "It would be one thing if I never have children. Unfortunately, I never had the chance of having children. Okay, that happens to people. But suddenly you gave me a bracha to have children, and now it's being taken away from me when my girl is only 12 years old. Please, Rebbe, this is too much." He begs her, "Please, Rebbe, give me a bracha for my child." So the tzaddik at Chernobyl says, the Chernobyl Rebbe, Matul says, gives him a bracha, and he says, "Don't worry, go back to your child." Okay, so he travels back home. He stays a couple days more vigil by her bedside, and then suddenly she wakes up. What happens when she wakes up is, Manish is overjoyed, and he's so happy. He hugs his daughter, he kisses her, he's filled with excitement. And after he calms down, Chana Rachel turns to him and she says, "I have something to tell you." He says, "What?" He goes, when I was in a coma, I went up to the heavenly Maiden. I went to the court on high, the court that decides what happens when you pass away, what happens when you go on to the afterlife. And at the Supreme Court on high, they told me that because of my actions, I'm receiving an Ibr Neshama. What does that mean? Well, the Kabbalah discusses a case, and this is brought down not only in Kabbalah, but in the Tanya, the seminal work of Chabad Hasidus, and it discusses a case where a person has a soul which can reach spiritually to a specific level of spirituality, meaning every soul has its limits about where it can reach in God's, in the various levels of spirituality which a soul can attain. And obviously there are greater souls than other souls. In other words, the soul of a tzaddik, the soul of a rebbe can reach much higher and can speak to God much closer and can become much closer to God than the soul of a regular person. But what happens sometimes is that you max out your abilities. A person takes full advantage of his soul and completely dedicates himself to God to a point where there's no more further they can reach beyond their capabilities. So the Betin, the high court on heaven, God decides that because this person went and took what I gave him, this soul that I gave him or her, and she used it out to the full abilities which she has, I'm going to give her a second soul. That soul will be the soul of a tzaddik. That soul will be the soul of a righteous person who will give her more strength and give her like a deep reservoir of spirituality to reach into and to further their relationship with God. We call this Ibur Neshama, the impregnation of the soul, meaning you're impregnating, so to speak, the person's soul with another soul. This soul does not possess the person. It does not take over the person like a dibuk, like an evil spirit that comes in and possesses the person and takes over this person's body. No, rather this is like an extra level which you can tap into, an extra. It's like a well which you can bring out extra strength to serve God. It's the exact opposite of an evil spirit taking over you. There are very few instances where we can tell in history where you hear about Ibur Neshamas because it's a very uncommon phenomenon. Mostly the reason is because our soul has a capability of connecting to God on so many different levels, right? It's like they talk about today, science talks about your brain. We use a tiny percentage of our brain. And we don't tap into most of it. In order for someone to use their entire everything, all the capabilities that they have, means that someone has to be dedicated to whatever cause it is completely. And so, if you want to be able to max out your capabilities of your soul, well, God is going to have to give you an extra soul so you can continue your spiritual travels. Then you must be completely dedicated. And very few people have ever attained such a thing. And very few people can actually use what they need and use out all their capabilities. But she turns to her father and she says, Chana says that this is what happened to me. She says, I fell into a coma and I received the Ibur Neshama. So, Monesh Verbermacher, right? Here's a man who in his time, in his era, in his era, he does not, women in general were never Torah scholars. Women didn't really have an opportunity to learn. And over here, not only is his daughter, someone who enjoys learning, but she's telling him that she has an extra soul given to her by God. So obviously, it was a big shock to his system, especially because the only instances really of women receiving any sort of spiritual aura coming into them or spirit was mostly, it had to do with dibiks, with a bad soul, with an evil soul coming in and sort of possessing the person, because it was thought of in those days that women were more refined and gentler souls, and so it was easier for an evil spirit who cannot find rest to possess the body of a woman. Now, whether such tendencies to think of such things were simply because it was an easier target and to scare women and to scare young girls into thinking that the body could be possessed by an evil spirit, that's up for debate. But the idea is there was definitely no instances of a woman receiving a second soul for God, or as we call the impregnation of the soul, the Ibur Neshama. So the first thing she does is she breaks off her shidduch. Okay. Why? And she writes to her fiance in a letter. She tells him that it's not because of anything you've done, but simply put, because I believe I've been chosen for a life of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, completely dedicated to God. And like Moshe, like the ultimate Rebbe, who separated from his wife at a certain point, I believe that it's not in my future to raise a family and to have the traditions of a homemaker and being a wife and my responsibilities toward my husband and children. I believe that my life mission is to simply be dedicated to God. So this whole story caused a tremendous upheaval in the town of Ludmir because, simply put, besides the fact that people didn't believe her that she had a second soul, breaking off a shidduch, okay, breaking off an arranged marriage, in some ways, was considered worse than getting a divorce, so to speak, in Jewish law. When I mean worse, I mean because there is a commitment. They wrote tnoyim. In other words, these days we write everything at the actual wedding, and so when you get married, everything is done at one time. But at those points, they would commit to each other in writing when they're engaged, and when they were married, it would be the second phase. So if you're talking about a person who broke off the engagement, in Ludmir, in those days, it was considered agreement to be married, a shidduch, a sacrament. It was holy, and you breaking it would cause a big problem. So Monesh began to be shunned in the whole community. You had to pay the whole dowry to the boy's family, and they had to pay even more money for the embarrassment the boy had to go through. And it became a scene in town where people started protesting, so to speak. They were against Chanarachel. They were against this girl who was breaking from tradition. Her and her father were cut off from the community, and a ban was put in place where she could not daven in the Ezras Nashim. She could not daven in the women's section of the shul. And so she davened and she prayed and she prayed and she learned and she continued on her way in her small room, in her house. Everybody thought that the story is basically finished. You know, here she was, this lady who was interesting. She broke up a shidduch, and that was the end of that. When she's 20 years old, what happens is that her father passed away. Monish Vermacher, at the end of his life, you know, his views on his daughter changed, and he slowly started to understand what his daughter was after and what his daughter's life must be like. And he appreciated, you know, who she was. And he died, you know, content, and not content in the way where he, you know, he saw grandchildren or he understood, but more that he understood that his daughter was meant for a different life. But after he dies, he leaves all his money to his daughter, and it was a considerable amount of money. It was a large fortune. And the first thing Chanarachel does is that she builds herself a shul. Now, to show the wealth of this lady, she built a 2-story building in brick. The town of Ludmir, even today, if you were to go back to Ludmir, is mostly built out of wood. And in those days, to have a brick building, which is one of the only buildings which could survive fires that frequently happened in villages and in towns across Russia at those times, you had to have a tremendous amount of money. And she definitely did, and she built this brick building. And over there, she used to start davening and praying. In the first floor, she rented out, or it was a floor for something else. But interestingly enough, it was called a Goyden Shtibel, because on the second floor was the floor where she had her shtibel, where she had her shul. And an interesting phenomenon began to happen. People started to flock to her shul. She started to get a whole following. And she abided completely by the laws of tznius, of modesty. She had a little annex built next to the main room of the shul. And in that room, she sat and she would partake in prayers, which the main room was the shul with the men, and there was a men's section and a women's section. And she would listen, and she began to host a tish, which means on Friday night, she would host a Hasidic gathering and people would come and they would listen to her saying Torahs, meaning she would come up with new insights into the Torah, self-made things that she had come up on her own, and she would say it from her annex. And if people came for yechidus, people came for a private audience with her, she would say it, she would listen from the annex with her door ajar, with the door a little bit open, and she would answer. And she became a massive drawing point for everybody around. Now, people came on various levels. Some people in Ludmir started following her, the simple people, because they really believed that she was holy, and they saw a holiness. They saw that she was a different type of person associated with her when they met her, or when they heard about her, when they saw her. They understood that this was a holy lady, and they became part of her court. Other people were attracted to her by the anomaly. Wow, a woman Rebbe, a female Rebbe. Can you imagine such a thing? And so people came. And then once they walked into the door, they saw that this lady was actually legitimate and that she wasn't just someone playing a part, then they came to stay. Other people came with the intentions of trying to shut her down, of trying to convince her to move on with her life. And once they came in and they spoke to her, they realized that she was the real deal, and they got stuck on. So people started to connect with her for different reasons. But what definitely happened was that she started gaining a large following, and she became the most popular Rebbe and the most popular shul in Ludmir. Now, not everybody liked that. Now, the reasons why not everybody liked that are various. The aristocratic part of the Jewish population of Ludmir, so to speak, the sophisticated Jews, right? They felt it was more threatening to them, Chana Rachel, they felt that she was more of a threat than the regular Jews. A simple-minded Jew was very basic, and if he thought that this person was holy and this person had a connection to God, they wanted to have something to do with her. But the more sophisticated Jews had problems, and they thought this might not be right according to Torah. The idea of a woman being a Rebbe, of leading a whole population, they felt that this might start a trend in the era that women will start to do things which were not traditionally done. In other words, because traditionally at that point, women in the ways European Jews view women, were that they had the wonderful job and the beautiful idea of raising a family and making a home and continuing on. And when here comes a girl who's not married and at the age of 20 becomes a leader in Judaism, she uproots the status quo, and it became a massive question amongst people who knew Torah. What is this woman? How can this be? And is she right? And a massive camp of people decided that they were against her, and they started to have, there was a backlash, and they were fighting to try to shut her down. Of course, there are people that were in this group that were there because they actually believed that what she was doing was not according to Torah law. And of course, there were people in this group that were plain and simple, probably misogynists, and didn't want women to start, taking positions held by men. But whatever the person's motivation was, it was definitely true that she was something different and something that had to be discussed, because we hadn't had a woman Rebbe ever. Also, and very interestingly enough, almost all Rabbi, almost all leaders in the Hasidic movement at that time were from a dynasty, right? The original batch, the first members of the Hasidic court were all self-made Rebbes, meaning they joined the movement and then they attracted a following. Their fathers weren't part of the Hasidic movement. They were the first ones to join. However, at this point, which is around the third to fourth generation of Hasidim and Hasidism in Russia, at that point, there was barely any Rebbes which were people that became Hasidim and didn't have an ancestry. Most of them were dynasties, and they belonged to a certain family, and you were worthy, then you were appointed the next Rebbe. So not only was Chana Rachel a woman, a female who became a Rebbe, but she was a lady who had no ancestry of her father wasn't a Rebbe, her grandfather wasn't a Rebbe, and so that was even more controversial. How can she become a Rebbe if she doesn't have the family heritage? And another step is that a lot of Rabbeim relied on small donations on Pidyonim. When you would go and ask the Rebbe for a bracha, they would accept a little money, it's tzedakah, and then that's how the Rebbes would live while they continued to disseminate their Hasidus and to, of course, promote what they believed in. But Chana Rachel was unique in that she didn't need any money because her father was very rich and very wealthy, and she didn't accept anything. So it basically came down to that in the area, certain rabbis are wanted to discuss this with her as more of a symbolic idea of what is the role of women in Judaism. And other rabbis were worried on a basic level. What do you mean people are starting to go to her and she's taking away my clientele? Now, of course, most rabbis, legitimate rabbis at that time, obviously they wanted to speak to her and wanted to have a discussion with Chana Rachel because they actually wanted to figure out what she was doing and if it was allowed according to Jewish law and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the Hasidim, when it comes to the followers of such leaders, many of them felt threatened by her existence, and therefore they became a massive opposition mounted. Now, while Chana Rachel was definitely similar to Rebbe, it is interesting to note that she definitely had similarities to other prominent fixtures in Jewish communities. Number one, she had a similarity to a Maggid. Now, A Magid was a preacher, meaning here was a person who did not want a following and did not stay in one town. Instead, this was a classic rabbi who would travel alone from town to town. He would come to the city or the town that he's visiting. He would ask to speak on shul, on Shabbos, or by mincha, or whatever it was. People would gather. He would say a moralizing sermon, trying to get the people to continue on and in their ways and serve God properly. And then he would move on to the next town. That was known as the Magid. Although certain Rabbeim, like the Magid of Mizrich, are known as Magids, if you were a Rebbe, you usually could not be a Magid. And the reason was because a Magid didn't want a following. He preferred to remain anonymous and to travel from town to town. On the other hand, a Rebbe would stay in one place and would attract people and attract the following. It is recorded that Chana Rachel would travel to towns nearby Ludmir and give these type of speeches. So she was like a Rebbe, that she had a following in Ludmir, and she was also like a Magid, that she would travel from town to town and give these sermons and have that idea. She also was similar to the Zagorke. Now, what's a Zagorke? Now it does not exist, but back in Europe, women weren't educated as well as they are today. And so therefore they did not know how to read Hebrew, most women. So the town would appoint one woman in the town who knew how to read Hebrew. And that woman would say all the davening, would say the prayers for all the other women. And if a woman had a specific request from God and she wanted it to be said in Hebrew, then she would ask this woman, and she was known as the Zagorke, the one who says in Yiddish, Zagorke. And it is definitely, we definitely have, it's recorded that Chana Rachel would daven for these people, for women in a town of Ludmir that could not daven for themselves. So she was also similar to the Jewish, she was a female, so to speak, a female leader of the other women in town, the Zagorke. Furthermore, there was also the woman healer, right? In villages along Russia, when the medicine, when a patient was too far gone for medicine, they would hunt down a woman who was known to have charms and amulets and to know how to say incantations, and they would ask her for her remedies. She would make them herbal remedies. And this woman had a secret way of tradition passed on from one to another. And she was, so to speak, like the witch, but not really a witch, but on a good witch, in which she could try to heal people through her various methods of different remedies that she would propose and different things that she would say. They would light black candles, they would go around circles, they would say certain things, they would make a paste or grind up a paste, and they would give it to the patient. And there are this was a common sight amongst communities of that era. And there's definitely stories of Chana Rachel giving remedies to people who have come to her in audiences and have gone out healed. So she was also similar to that. So you're understanding that in the inner height, Chana Rachel was much more than just, we call her a female Rebbe. That's missing out on how singular, how different she was. She took a bunch of positions and she combined it into one, and she was this unique figure. There was nothing like her amongst the land. As her fame grew and grew, it came to a point of where it attracted the attention of the prominent tzaddik in the area, which was, his name was Mendel of Chernobyl. And the very person who had given her father a bracha for her birth. And so he traveled to Ludmir, and he requested an audience. Now in the past, with Chana Rachel. Now in the past, Chana Rachel had refused any audience with people, based on the grounds that she decided that she didn't want to speak to people because she felt it wasn't worth it. But when the great Rebbe, Mendel of Chernobyl, came to her village, she couldn't, she couldn't say no. And so they arranged that they would have a third for everything was abided by the laws of modesty. And they had this meeting. Now, the content of the meeting was on the question of if a woman has the obligation to get married and have children. And so Mendel says, what do you mean? The first commandment in the Torah is Puruhu, be fruitful and multiply, meaning family. Family is a central idea in Judaism, and every single Jew has an obligation. And to be a good Jew is to start a family and to invest in family, and that's the whole basis of the whole Judaism. And obviously Chana Rachel said, but she claimed that there are exceptions to this rule, and I am one of them. And she further said that technically, according to Jewish law, a man has to have children, but a woman doesn't have to have children. The commandment only applies to men. It doesn't apply to women. And of course, he countered that the reason why it doesn't apply to women is because the Torah didn't explicitly say that women should have kids, because the Torah understands that women naturally want to have kids, are more inclined to have kids than men, so they didn't feel the need to tell them. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And although we don't know exactly the details of how he convinced her, at the end, definitely because of the tremendous pressure must have been on her, Chana Rachel agreed to get married. And they made a shidduch with a sefer in town, and they hurriedly decided they're going to make a wedding immediately in a couple of days. And that was it. And they decided to make a wedding. And the whole town was buzzing with this, but it happened very quickly. The wedding was held a couple of nights later, and they went home. The chassan and kala, the bride and the groom, went home together. And Reb Muttel picked up his bags. He got onto his horse and wagon, and he traveled off to Chernobyl. What happens next is, so that was the trajectory of her in her rise. That was the rise of Chana Rachel. And for a few years there, Chana Rachel was the biggest sensation in the area. What happened next is that the night after the wedding, we don't know exactly what went down in her house. What we do know is that her husband left her the next morning. And it is definitely true that the wedding was not consummated. These people did not have intimate relations, Chana Rachel and her husband. Some people in the town started to rumor that it was because Chana Rachel didn't want to. And some people said that no, it was because her husband thought she was so holy that he didn't want to have relations with her. But at the end of the day, what definitely happened is the wedding was never consummated. And her husband left and demanded a divorce. And she demanded a divorce, and which most people say she received, other people say she didn't receive. But the point is, she separated from her husband right now. The opposition to Chana Rachel and her ways came up with a brilliant strategy, and that is to say that she was possessed by a dibble. And the reason that she was acting like a male, meaning that she was leading and she was fulfilling the commandments of a male, was because she was possessed by a dibuk. Now, a dibuk is when the Kabbalah talks about a dibuk, meaning when a spirit who goes into this world, there's a soul comes to this world, and when he or she dies, they go back up to the heaven, and the court in heaven finds that this soul did not complete its task in this world. So they send them back down. They say, don't come back up until you fulfill your task. The spirit haunts the graveyard of their body of their former, their former life, and they can't complete their task because they don't have a body to possess, so to speak. And usually in a graveyard, they will possess a individual who is a weaker spirit. Most of the time, it was the stories have to do with women. They would attack them, so to speak, take hold of them, and then possess this person. The only way you can get a dibuk out of someone, a spirit that possesses and takes control of a person's body, was through an exorcism, which was performed by a skilled Kabbalist, and he would draw out the soul and banish him back to the high court. So the opponents of Chana Rachel came out with a brilliant smear campaign that she was possessed by a dibuk, and that's why her conduct was that of a male, because she was possessed by a male dibuk, and this dibuk, this malevolent spirit, was haunting her and making her do these things. And so that opposition, coupled with the fact that she had just got married, led to her fall from grace. It seemed that as soon as she got married, all of her wonder and the fact that she was such an anomaly was lost upon people. Because when she was single, she represented someone who was much different than the status quo. Completely different. No women didn't get married willingly. People, unfortunately, couldn't find shidduchim, but everybody would want to get married at her age. The fact that this was a woman who refused to get married for years and years and years made her so interesting. And then the fact that she was a Rebbe, people were attracted to her. But as soon as she got married, even though the marriage ended in disaster the next morning, people began to lose interest in her. And she became like every other person. Also, there are reports of her herself feeling like she had lost a level of her spirituality after she had gotten married. She felt that she wasn't as close, as big of a tzaddik, as big of a righteous person as she once was. And so her following began to dwindle slowly but surely, and people did not see her as a threat anymore. And the rabbis didn't really attend to her because she was a married woman. She was like all other women. So she was a married woman who might fulfill the commandments of a man, but didn't feel like she was a threat to the status quo of the way people viewed women those days. And slowly but surely, she lost her following. And for 20 years, in Ludmir, she lived and she had no following, and she barely had anybody coming to her steeple, and she basically became an anonymous woman like any other person in that town. And it was a swift fall from grace. It happened in one night, and it transformed her life. And for years and years after that, for 20 to 30 years, she lived in the town of Ludmir, and there were other Hasidic courts set up there, and nobody really paid attention to her. About 20 to 30 years later, she decides that it's enough. Her life is, she feels like she's not fulfilling her life, and she always had a dream, like many Hasidic masters, like let's say the Baal Shem Tov. She wanted to go to Israel. So she packs her bags, and she decides that she's traveling to Israel. She still has money, and that afforded her to get her trip, and she starts going to Israel. A lot of women in that era give her kvitlach, they give her notes to try to go put by the koisel when she gets to Israel, and she takes on the perilous journey. When she leaves Ludmir, ironically, the people who buy the Geirenstiebel, the people who buy and take over the building which formerly housed her Hasidic court, was actually a member of the Chernobyl dynasty. So it became full circle, so to speak, and she left the town. And people would talk about her, and the story of Chana Rachel of Ludmir was circulating in Ludmir streets for a long time afterwards. But she moved on, and then she moved to Israel. And this is where we find her rebirth in the land of Israel, where she came to Yerushalayim in an era, and she came to Yerushalayim in the mid-1800s, a time in which Jews were slowly migrating back to the land of Israel. And she lived on Chevron Street in Yerushalayim, or in Mea Shearim, in the original Hasidic community in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And slowly but surely, most people say that she gained a following. There are many stories being told of her having a Hasidic tish again, of Friday nights in Mea Shearim or on Chevron Street, of her house, of people packing in, of her saying Hasidic and Torah insights again, and of her accepting women petitions to pray for women, and she gained a following. However, there is a other view which will say Chana Rachel actually preferred to remain anonymous, and she ran a drugstore until she passed away. So different opinions, but definitely according to the more accepted one, she again attracted a following, and every month she would travel to Cave Rachel with a lot of women, and they would pray at Cave Rachel for the Jewish nation. And she had a whole following of women. It is definitely true that that in Israel, her following was mostly made up of women more than men. In fact, also, it is common knowledge, or it is at least most people agree, that in Israel, a lot of Arab women were attracted to Chana Rachel, and she had a whole following of people that actually weren't Jewish but Arab. Now you have to understand, at that time, the Arab population was actually got along with Jews very well. And in Arab culture, there were a lot of holy women, and so they were able to accept a holy woman much more readily than other people. And so she gained a large following of Jewish women and of Arab women, and she sort of became back into her status as a Rebbe. Of course, it is something we should note, that perhaps the reason why she was able to regain her following is because at that point, Chana Rachel was no longer eligible to have children. She was an older woman, and her not being married and her being a Rebbe wasn't as big as a controversy because she was seen as past her prime. But for whatever reason it was, she definitely gained a following, not a question. And in fact, there are rumors of her being the one Kabbalist woman, the one woman who was a master of Kabbalah. There's an interesting tale, and it goes as follows: that there was a man who was a Kabbalist, and he met up with Chana Rachel Berbermacher, and they decided together they're going to bring Mashiach. That's it. They've had enough. We're going to bring the Mashiach. We're going to bring the Messiah. We're going to end this galus, this exile, which the Jewish people are in. And so they decided they're going to meet at a certain cave on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And over there, they're going to use Kabbalah Masit. So there are two parts of the Kabbalah. There's the part of the Kabbalah which we learn and discusses how the world runs and how God creates the world and the Sephiros and celestial beings and the understandings of how the world runs. And then there's what we call Kabbalah Masit, which you would call that, let's say, when the legend is that the Maharal created a Goylam. How do you create something out of nothing? How do you breathe life into something as a human being? Well, that's why you use practical Kabbalah, where Kabbalah can actually affect the day-to-day ongoings of a person. And so they planned on using this Kabbalah Masid, practical Kabbalah, and to force Mashiach to come. And she got up in the middle of the night and she goes to the mikveh, and then she travels to this cave, and she's sitting at this cave and she's waiting and she's waiting and she's waiting and she's waiting, and eventually dawn comes and the person doesn't appear. And she goes, no, it's obviously a sign, it's not meant to be. And she travels back to her town. The story goes that the other tzaddik Nister, the other hidden tzaddik, the other Kabbalist, was walking out of his house ready to go to the cave on his way when he meets a bearded man who says, hey, can I come in for a tea for your house for a second? So he invites him in for a couple of minutes just to have, some tea. And as he sits and he's having tea, he starts discussing with him wondrous secrets of the Torah. And he's going back and forth and he completely gets distracted. And then when it comes the morning, this man says, okay, it's time for me to go, and he leaves. And the Kabbalist suddenly realizes that it's too late and he got distracted and he can no longer try to meet up with Chana Rachel. Legend has it, this man that distracted Chana Rachel's partner was indeed Eliyahu Hanavi, making sure that he did not use Kabbalah, practical Kabbalah, to try to bring Mashiach before his time. But these types of stories are pretty common in that era of Kabbalist and of Hasidic thought. But the fact that it happened with Chana Rachel shows us, the fact that it was such a story shows us that she was indeed a very big Kabbalist. The fact that they can associate her with such a story means that she was indeed a very big Kabbalist, and it was something unique, which almost no Kabbalist masters of Kabbalah were known to be women. Eventually, Chana Rachel, also another interesting note is that Chana Rachel used to take people's prayers and read them by the kaisel. In those days, there wasn't a mechitza by the kaisel. In those days, it was whoever could get in, because obviously the kaisel wasn't what it was like today. It wasn't a big open space. It was mainly an alleyway, and she would go and pray for men and women by the kaisel, and the sightings of her by the kaisel were quite common. Chana Rachel passes away at the turn of the 20th century. Some people say she gets buried in Jerusalem on Har HaZeisim, on the Mount of Olives. Others record her being shipped up to Tzfas and being buried in the big cemetery there amongst the Kabbalists. And other people believe she was brought back to Ludmir and buried in the graveyard of Ludmir. In fact, getting back to our beginning, when Ansky went around trying to document Jewish life, he was looking for the Maiden of Ludmir. He was looking in the cemetery to see perhaps if she was buried there. And that is the story in the short version of this interesting and this wonderful woman's life. I'd like to finish with a couple of points, as we a little bit over time here. But to finish up, I was listening to a class by Elie Wiesel on the Maiden of Ludmir, and he speaks. Elie Wiesel speaks so wonderfully, and so beautifully, and so eloquently. And he quoted Ansky, and he said like this. He says like this. He says, "With every old man who dies, with every fire that breaks out, with every exile we suffer, we lose a part of our past. The best examples of our tradition, our customs, our beliefs are vanishing. The old tales and melodies will soon be forgotten. In short, our past, sanctified by the blood and tears of so many innocent martyrs, is vanishing, and soon will vanish. So on a basic level, we must understand, we must know the tales of the past in order to know who we are and how to continue on in today's day and world. And today it's even more important that we start discussing what does it mean to be a Jewish woman and what the role of women are in Judaism, and to start bringing up this lady and to try to understand if she was an exception to the rule, what was her exception, what was she right in, what was she wrong in. A discussion has to be had and should be had in today's day and age, and not to be afraid of remembering people that were unique and that changed the course of Jewish history. And with that, I think we're done here today. Thank you very much for everybody listening. Again, if anybody wants to search her up or learn her more in depth, I recommend you, there's a book they called Her Rebbe by Gershon Winkler, or there's another book called The Maiden of Ludmir by Nathaniel Deitch, or there's a class of Elie Wiesel. You can find that on YouTube, a wonderful class. Please ask, learn about her, and continue on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mendel. That was a fascinating presentation, really well presented and well researched. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much for gracing us with that this morning. We'll transition to our second presenter now, starting around noon. We have Rabbi Yonason Johnson